Hey, welcome to Unlatched Mind. Have a couple guests on today. Dr. Jeff Barke, who we've had on before. He's a board-certified family medicine physician. And also we have on Shane Siegel. Shane's actually a personal friend of mine. Shane's a foreign service officer, currently serving over at the U.S. Embassy in the Netherlands. I recorded this back in mid-January. It was shortly after the Capitol riots here in the U.S., which occurred on January 6th, 2021. What I really wanted to do is just have an open dialogue about the Trump administration. The Trump presidency was coming to an end. There's so much chaos out there with you turn on the news and the news is nauseating. So I really want to have an open, honest dialogue with opposing sides. I know Dr. Barke's position on several things, and I know Shane's position on some things, and I knew the dialogue would be intellectually honest, very thought provoking on both sides, and I knew they'd have some opposing views on some things. But above all, I know it would just be an intellectually honest discussion, and I really enjoyed it. So. Yeah, this one was an easy one for me, right? I just got two super smart dudes in the room, and I was able to be just the ape. I was the ape in the room and just allowed them to talk and have a good dialogue. So let's just jump in. With that, I give you Shane Siegel and Dr. Jeff Barke. Dr. Barke, Shane, I appreciate your time today. Let's just jump right in. So one of the things I had sent you guys, and I just wanted to jump right in on this, is I see a difference between some of Trump's supporters versus some of Trump's opposition, and I always feel like there's a difference between his opponents tend to focus on his personality flaws and not really his policies so much, while the supporters are kind of flip, where they look at all the good stuff he did. He's harder on China, and maybe just start with you, Shane. What thoughts on that? Is that a decent observation, or am I way off there?
Sure. Look, I think it's a decent observation. It's an honest observation. I would argue that those who disagree with him, so most of the folks on the left, disagree with both his policies and his personality, right? And I think that makes it a little bit different than maybe previous presidents. Whereas folks on the right will point to some of the policy accomplishments that he's had, if you want to call them accomplishments. On the foreign policy side, you've got Israel with the Abraham Accords. You've got free trade agreement, or the new NAFTA, if you will. Back home, you've got things like all the judges that he's been able to get through. You've got the 3 people he was able to put on the bench on the Supreme Court. In that sense, he's been consequential, no doubt about it. But I think if I'm looking at it from a pure poli-sci standpoint, the recent events and the fact that at the end of the day, he incited what is an insurrection against the United States government is going to be what he's remembered for, along with COVID, right? Those two things are going to be what paint his presidency, for better or for worse. And I look, it's always hard to analyze something in the immediate aftermath of it. I think you need time to be able to give it an honest analysis, but I struggle to see how he's going to be looked upon favorably over time, considering how the COVID situation was bungled and considering what just happened at the Capitol.
Yeah. Okay, Dr. Barke, your take.
Looked upon favorably if we got rid of COVID and we got rid of the Capitol shenanigans. The left still would not look upon him favorably. There's a study recently out that asked the question amongst Republicans that if Trump were to run again in 2024, would you vote for him? I don't remember the exact number, but it was about 90 or 95% of Republicans said, yes, I'd vote for him again. So this idea, because of COVID, and we can talk about, I don't think he handled COVID in a way that should be disrespected or criticized. In fact, I think all things considered, he did a pretty darn good job. And we can talk about the Capitol, and Shane describes this as him inciting some sort of insurrection. I, of course, disagree with that vehemently. But regardless, the right is going to look back on him with great pleasure. And if you look at the accomplishments, Shane mentions the Abraham Accords and SCOTUS picks and so forth, but there is so much more than just that, things that he was able to get accomplished. Now, I'm not a huge fan of his Twitter activity, and he says many stupid things that I think are completely unnecessary and only harmful to actually passing policy, most of which I agree with. But I do have friends that love that he's a fighter, and they look back at history and say, for the first time that they can ever remember, we finally have somebody that was willing to punch the other side in the nose and not just be passive. And some people really like it. I don't personally like it. During the election cycle, the primary cycle that led up to Trump's election, my wife and I were strong supporters of Dr. Ben Carson. And the reason why we like Ben is because of his personality. He was very quiet, reserved, polite, but he had very strong conservative convictions. I suspect if he were president, we might see very similar policies without some of the Twitter wars and social media nonsense. But this is, this is unique to Trump now, because never in our history have we been in a time where we had the ability to instantaneously communicate vis-a-vis Twitter or Facebook or other social media outlets. It has never been the case, even under President Obama. Twitter wasn't to the degree it was, and Facebook wasn't lifted up to the means of communication that we have now. And so I think unique to this presidency is the ability to instantly communicate with millions and millions of people and to bypass the mainstream media that by far tilts far left, with very few exceptions. And so I believe most people on the left do not understand people on the right. I don't think they read us. I don't think they tune into us. I don't think they listen to us. Now, I'm generalizing. Of course, there are always exceptions. But I do believe many of us on the right are much more in tune with the thinking and policy prescriptions of the left. And the reason why is not that it's unique to individuals. We're not smarter or better or worse than anybody on the left, but we have access to, and it's almost hard to avoid turning on the TV, whether it's CNBC or CNN or MSNBC or all of the networks that the left owns, and all most media newspapers, New York Times, Los Angeles Times, even the Orange County Register these days, the news section of the Wall Street Journal, opinions aside, it is all left of center. So we're enveloped in this, and we learn a lot about the way the left thinks. We've only have literally a couple media outlets that tilt right. Of course, we have Fox News. We have a lot of talk radio with people that are right of center. But I just believe, as a result of the nature of the way media is, the right has a much better understanding of the left than the left does of the right. And as a result, you see some of the division that we have now, and you have a belief system that is completely different. One of my favorite talk radio people is Dennis Prager, and he's got an expression that I'd rather have clarity to agreement. And I think that's important. Even our discussion today. I don't know Shane. We've never met. I appreciate the work that you do. And Shane, you mentioned before we went on air that you're calling in from far, far away in the Netherlands, and I'm sitting here in beautiful Southern California where it's 70 degrees with blue skies. So I don't know you, Shane, but I appreciate the opportunity to have a dialogue, to listen to each other, even where we may disagree, and see if there is common ground, or at least to have clarity.
Absolutely.
Well,
Absolutely.
I guarantee you both love the country. I know you both, and I guarantee you both love the country. And that's honestly, and I say the country, the USA. I know you're not in the country right now, Shane. So, but because and that's one thing I would criticize Trump for. Right? It was that, you know, I felt like it was us versus them more than and at least in my memory, it was us versus them. It wasn't a we. Now, maybe that's just politics in general. Where you have a Democratic president or a Republican president, there's always the us versus them thing. But I just feel like that was doubled and tripled down during this administration, where it's like, and we'll get to some of the racism stuff and stuff later. But even putting that aside for a second, you know, looking at the Capitol, and somebody at work made a good point the other day to me. He's kind of like, well, if you look at the amount of flag, there was more Trump flags than American flags by far, and that got me thinking. Was like, well, isn't that sort of indicative of the divisive nature there? I don't know. I mean, is that? I mean, Shane, what does that? that resonate at all? I mean, and maybe they're one and the same, but I don't think so. I guess you know, what I mean? It's like I feel like that's a look at not it's they're against us. We must fight back. You know, I don't know.
Look, I think I'd be hard pressed to come up with an argument against what you just said. I think it's clear that he took a very strong us against them stance, and whether you support his policies or not, there's no question that we're more divided today than we were in 2016. Not to say that we were particularly unified then, because we weren't. But replaying a little bit, there's a couple things from what Dr. Burke said that I think need to be addressed. When we talk about the COVID rollout, and look, I'm not a doctor, so I recognize where you have your expertise, and that is somewhere I don't. But what I can say is he downplayed it. He admitted later on to a journalist that he knew how serious it was, but wouldn't tell the American people. And to me, that's a serious, serious abrogation of his responsibility and his duty. Now, the actual development of the vaccine, huge credit has to go out there, but the rollout of it has been a disaster. So I think, and regardless of all that, leaving that aside, oftentimes when you're at the helm of a ship, you get the credit, but you also get tarnished by what's going on in the world around you. And at the end of the day, COVID's going to tarnish him, no matter how well or poorly he did handling it. On the Capitol, this one's tough for me because to call it anything other than an insurrection when you have folks literally storming the Capitol, literally taking over our seat of government, and now the FBI is saying that there might have been plans to try to capture and assassinate some of our members of government.
They just walked that back, by the way, Shane.
So here's the thing: we're taping this 10 days after it happened. I think it's a little bit early. We don't know, but there were folks who went in there with weapons. There are folks who went in there with bombs. There are folks who went in there with zip ties. So, from an outsider's perspective, when I'm looking at what's happening, if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's a duck, right? But if we're not calling it an insurrection, then I don't know what a violent attempted overthrow, like what word would we use to define what happened?
Well, that's a good question, and I don't really care what name you give it, but part of the concern is that you can call it an insurrection, as perhaps you should call that as well with the violent riots that occurred all over the country this last summer, especially ones that took over police stations and state capitals. But the left was quick to downplay that, just describe those as peaceful protests, even though with our own eyes we could see it wasn't. But the question is, okay, let's call it an insurrection if you want to call it that. But whose fault is it? So as Trump is giving his speech, I wasn't there, but I had friends that were. As Trump is giving his speech at the White House, before he even completed his speech, before he even said, and now we're going to move to the Capitol and peacefully protest and demonstrate democracy. Before he even said that, there were people breaking into the Capitol. We now have evidence, the FBI reports on some of these folks that were arrested, that these actions were actually pre-planned long before Trump's speech at the rotunda there. And so I don't think it's fair to blame Trump for what happened. And I think it's a bit hypocritical to say Trump is responsible for the insurrection, but we give all the lawmakers a pass that look the other way when these riots that were actually killing people over the summer and taking over capitals and setting up Chad up in Seattle and the like, when they were giving all those people a pass. Now, it's not about whataboutism. So what I try to do is to be consistent. What happened at the Capitol was disgusting and it was horrible. And insurrection-like, fine, I'm okay with that. To blame it on President Trump, though, I don't think is fair. And especially it's not fair coming from folks that gave all those riotous people a pass over the summer. And heck, it's still going on today. And when you have people that are murdered every single weekend in some of our major cities like Chicago and Detroit and others, yet we're radio silent on that. But we're focused on what Trump's role may have been or may not have been in encouraging people to gather at the mall. And ultimately, it led to this horrible thing at the Capitol. I just don't think it's fair.
So again, hold on, Vinny, I got to jump in. There's a lot
go
to
ahead.
unpack. There's a lot to unpack there. I really need to be careful because I don't want to come off as some uber left guy because I'm actually not. I'm pretty centrist at the end of the day. I wouldn't be doing my job if I was anything other than that. Um, but if we're talking about the Capitol and we're talking about it not being whataboutism, then we shouldn't use the well, what about, right? It's either A or B. But if we're going to try and compare the two, I think we need to do that, try to do that objectively, right? So, and in order to do that, we have to say what was the what and what was the why. The what was riots in the summer that were completely unacceptable. I'll be the first to come out and say that. Anytime you riot or loot, you've lost me. Doesn't matter why. Anytime you try to overthrow the government, that's worse. But I think we both agree that that's unacceptable. But then the what does matter, right? It's important. And to me, the what on the one side is folks protesting a criminal justice system that is biased. And maybe we disagree on that, but that's what they were out on the streets trying to accomplish, trying to protest. And then on the other side, you had folks, and you say they weren't incited by Trump. You say they'd already started before he even gave a speech, except they wouldn't have been there if it wasn't for this big lie, right? And I don't know if we agree on this, but if we do agree that it was a big lie, if we do agree that the vote was completely free and completely fair and completely open, then we have to say that he bears the burden of those folks having been there in the first place. The actual words he used on the day were pretty insightful. We can talk about the timing of it, but they would never have been there if it wasn't for Trump. And it wasn't the fact that he kept saying this was the biggest, witch hunt in history. This is the biggest fraud ever. It wasn't a fraud. The Republicans in Georgia, the Republicans in Arizona, the Republicans in a bunch of these states came out and said, no, these were free, fair elections. So to me, if you're looking at it objectively and you're saying, why were they even there in the beginning? They were there because of Trump. So he
No,
does bear responsibility.
Fair enough. Let me ask you this, Shane, and we can get into whether, as you described, the big lie is actually a big lie. Let's assume, just for argument, just for this moment, that it's not a big lie, that there were shenanigans that went on in many of the battleground states that rose to the level of unconstitutional mechanisms of ultimately electing Joe Biden. Let's just assume for a moment that that's true. If that were true, then would it be okay for people that were upset with that to petition their government for grievances, to rally on the mall? And there's, Trump is not unique to bringing people on the mall for all kinds of things. There's been Black Lives Matters rallies on the mall and so forth, and hundreds of thousands of people that show up there. But that people came to the mall and Trump encouraged it is a non sequitur. It's a non sequitur to what happened at the Capitol, because 99% of the people that showed up to listen to Trump, to either carry an American flag or a Trump flag, were not involved in what happened at the Capitol. And so it's not fair to paint most of the Trump supporters, the vast majority of Trump supporters that showed up there to protest, rightfully or wrongfully, what they believed to be an election that was handled in a way that was unconstitutional. And listen, I've listened to constitutional scholars that disagree with your perspective that it was a big lie. And these are not flamethrowers. These are people like John Eastman, for example, that has been in academia for decades, who represented Trump during his first impeachment and may represent him again in this impeachment, that lays out a constitutional narrative that says, yes, Biden won, but look at what happened in these various states where state government officials ran an election that was contrary to the state legislators. So that's what they're arguing. And this whole notion of these massive mail-in ballots that were sent out unsolicited to millions and millions of people. And as you know, I live in California. My kids are no longer in California. They haven't been. My son lives and works in D.C. My daughter's in Wisconsin. Yet year after year after year, for the past several years, we continue to get their absentee ballots that are mailed to our house. And I'm sure that happens thousands and thousands of times. It would have been very simple for me to fill out their ballot and send it in, and nobody would have known different. And that would be a federal election violation. I'd be committing a felony, if you will. And that's what happens when you mail ballots unsolicited to millions and millions of people. So I don't agree with the idea that it was a big lie. Even if it was a big lie, that still gives people the right to gather on the mall. It doesn't give them the right to do what they do in the Capitol. And I strongly, strongly am against and protest and vehemently shout out against what happened in the Capitol. If you want to call it an insurrection, I don't mind you doing so. And I think there's some truth to that. But to blame that on Donald Trump, I don't think is fair, and I don't think is accurate.
So, actually, I'm really glad we're having this conversation because it's pointing to a much bigger issue that I think exists in the United States, and that's that we are literally working off a different set of what I would call facts, even though you can't have different set of facts, right? There's just facts and the non-truth. And this is where it becomes tough for me. You said, well, let's pretend like, or let's look at it as if. You can't look at it as if, because there's what actually happened and there's what didn't. Don't take my word for it. Take the Republican secretaries of state in these states that said, no, these were free and fair elections, right? So you said, well, it's possible if there's more mail-in ballots that maybe there'd be more fraud, except when they looked at it, there's not one case of systematic fraud. Now, that's not to say there wasn't individual cases of fraud. That's two totally different things. But fraud on the level that could impact an election, not one instance of it. And again, this is like any big conspiracy theory that's out there in the world. In order to pull these things off, you need so many people to be in on it as to make it impossible for it to actually be pulled off without other folks knowing about it. So this concept that the big lie is a real thing. I don't know how we move forward in a debate, in a conversation, in a body politic, if we can't even agree on what actually happened. And on this side, I'm going to agree with the left. They actually have the folks on the other side saying, no, look, it was free and fair. And then you have some folks on the right who are saying, no, I refuse to believe it. I refuse to believe it because of hypotheticals. I refuse to believe it because I look around me and I don't see enough people to vote for Biden, so I can't believe that 80 million people would vote for Biden. The interesting thing that you brought up was this notion of unconstitutionality in certain states. And I think what you're getting at is that certain states didn't allow for either the mail-in ballots to be received after a date certain, or for those ballots to not be able to be counted after a date certain. And to me, this gets into this concept of voting rights, right? Do we want to be a country that allows folks, that enables them the right to be able to express themselves? If we do, then I don't see the problem with letting votes come in so long as they were sent according to the law ahead of time. I don't care if they arrive at 4 o'clock or 6 o'clock or 8 o'clock. I don't care if they were mailed to you or if you asked for it. If you are a citizen and you are in good standing, you have the right to vote. Why not make it easier? Why are we trying to make it harder for people to vote? I don't understand that. To me, that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I don't want to get into a fact, fact for fact based in every state and who said what and who said this, because we could literally spend the next hour. I disagree with you. I think there were significant voting irregularities. I think mailing out ballots unsolicited is a source of significant fraud. And there are plenty of people that are academic and are a lot smarter than I am. Heck, I'm a doctor. I'm not a politician, and I'm certainly not an attorney. That have evidence and facts to back up their assertion that there were enough irregularities that warrant the challenging of the electors in various states. And why don't we make it as easy as possible for people to vote? We actually should, but only to the extent that it is not able to be fraudulent. So, for example, actually, I think, Shane, you and I could sit down and probably create a voting system that states could follow that would make a lot of sense. Right now, we do it in such a disparate way that it just blows my mind that an election almost anywhere can be free and fair the way we set this up. We almost set it up purposely to being ambiguous and wrought with problems. So, for example, we don't have mandatory voter ID. Oh, wait, you're a racist if you want voter ID because it disenfranchises so many people. Yet here we are, we're requiring voter ID. We're requiring ID to get the COVID vaccination, for example. You have to show an ID to prove that you're eligible and then go on a national database if you want the COVID vaccination.
But Dr. Barke,
Yeah,
is the same people who make the argument that, right, but I don't need an ID to get a gun, right? So it's always like on the one side, it's okay, but on the other side, it's not. To me, if you're a citizen,
you
right, if
do
you're
need an ID to get a gun, by the way.
not everywhere and not at gun shows,
Most places you do.
but you just said it, most places, but not everywhere, right? So the point is, it's not always. And in fact, the only people that would argue for the gun show loophole are the folks on the right. I'm not saying you, and I'm just trying to point out the fact that there's a hypocritical nature to this concept of, well, the IDs have to be, needed. To me, it's really hard to keep justifying more and more measures to make it harder for people to vote when systemic fraud has literally never been pointed out in the United States. Never.
Well, you and I disagree on that.
But the courts agree with me, right? So if there was evidence, actual evidence, then there'd be court cases that the right would have won. Except they don't ever.
The courts, of course, didn't hear any evidence for this election cycle. They refused to on technicalities and standing issues and so forth. And there's still a few that are in front of the Supreme Court that may be heard as time moves on. Okay, so you and I agree then. I'll give you IDs for every single gun purchase if you give me IDs for every single vote. How about that?
If you make IDs easy to get for all citizens, absolutely.
Is it difficult to get for any citizen?
It is. In certain, if you are a poor person in, I don't know, rural Louisiana, or you're a poor person in urban Chicago, yeah, it's not actually that easy to get it. Maybe you don't have a gas bill. Maybe you don't have, you might not buy it. It's the truth.
It's not the truth. Then why do we require ID for everything else we do, to buy alcohol, for example, to get on an airplane, for example? Almost any interaction with any government agency requires some form of ID, except voting, of course.
So what I would say is if everyone had equal access to IDs, then I would say, sure, no problem. Because I do agree with you with one thing. I think if rational people sat down, you would come up with a more fair system. I think what you said is spot on. I do take umbrage with the notion that we live in a society where everyone has equal access to everything, because we just don't. And this isn't a purely race thing, right? It's not race. It's socioeconomic based more than race based, to be honest. Those with affluence have it much easier.
Has it ever been anything different?
No, of course not. Of course not. But does that make it okay?
Yeah, it does actually make it okay, because what I don't want is what the left often wants, and that's equal outcomes, not equal access. And so equal access to voter IDs and to any kind of ID, I'm just not aware of that being a significant hindrance for anybody to obtain. It's so easy to get an ID anywhere you live, anywhere in the country. And why do we require it to get on an airplane or to do many other activities if it's in fact racist or somehow xenophobic or otherwise discriminatory? Why do we impart ID requirements for everything else that we do in public life?
So I wouldn't say it's everything we do. I would actually agree with you in certain senses, right? There are times where we need IDs. Getting on a plane makes a lot of sense, right? Although it didn't always used to be the case. It became the case more and more as flying became more and more dangerous, right? Same with driving. As driving has become more dangerous, as more regulations have been put onto it, then we've needed more IDs. But voting, the basic concept of voting is that every citizen should have the ability to vote. Now, if you're saying that the reason you want to have voting is purely to stop fraud, fine, then let's come up with a way to make the system as impossible as you'd like to not be fraudulent. And if that's IDs, then let's come up with a way to fairly get everyone IDs. I'm totally on board with that.
Cool.
What I'm not on board with, though, and this is really important, is trying to disenfranchise voters of any ilk, of any stripe, just because they don't agree with you, because that's the way that one side thinks they can hold on to power longer.
Oh,
right?
I agree.
It should be a battle of ideas, period.
We're in agreement with that. I don't want to disenfranchise anybody. I want everybody to have equal and fair access to their constitutional right of voting, assuming that they're a citizen.
Yep, agreed.
And the way we do that, so everybody has confidence that that Tuesday night in November when votes are cast, that it's a fair and free election is to create a system where there isn't ambiguity, where you don't literally mail out millions and millions of ballots to people that didn't ask for them to be mailed out, some of whom haven't voted in years. I think that's just crazy town that we do that.
But hold
And
on, let me ask, because there are states, for example, I lived in Washington for a short stint, and Washington
uh-huh,
is almost entirely mail-in ballots, and they don't have any fraud. Truly, they don't have any fraud. So and they're not the only state. There's a number of states that have been doing mail-in voting for a long time, and the science behind it has shown that it's not any more fraudulent than in-person voting. So are you saying you're against mailing out ballots to folks who don't request it, or are you just against the concept of mail-in voting writ large?
No, I'm fine with mailing out ballots to people that want to vote absentee. I've been voting absentee for years just because it's convenient. I don't know where I'm going to be. I travel a lot, and this, that, and the other, and I like
Sure.
to sit down at my kitchen table. My wife and I, we pull out the ballot, we look at the various propositions here in California, and we make a decision. That's a
Mhm.
convenience that's great. I haven't been to a polling place other than to physically drop off my ballot in years. And I don't have a problem with that as long as it's done in a way that assures that there is no fraud. But what happened here in California, I can't speak for other states. And of course, as a result of federalism, every state runs their own election. They have to follow the federal rules of federal elections, but they run their own election. What happened here in California is a ballot was mailed out to everybody and their mother, whether they requested it or not. And the end result was people that haven't voted in years got ballots and they didn't even know what to do with. People that had died got ballots. People that no longer lived in California, my son and my daughter, received ballots. So these voting rolls need to be cleaned up. Maybe we look to Washington if that's correct what you're saying. They've been doing it for years and there's no fraud. We look at Washington and best practices to figure out how to do this. But in my opinion, a ballot should never be mailed out to somebody unless they specifically request it and do so through a means that can prove that they are a legal and eligible voter. And I think I don't have a problem with mail-in ballots like absentee ballots like we have in California. But in California, for example, once you apply for a permanent absentee ballot, that ballot is mailed to you forever, as is the case of my kids who have left California, haven't lived here in years, and they still get a ballot. And I'm sure that's the case with thousands and thousands of other people. So to the extent that you want an absentee ballot, you should have to request it on an annual basis to prove that you're still a legal resident of the state that you want to vote in, to prove that you're still eligible to vote, that you're not a felon, for example. Felons are not allowed to vote, at least
In
in
some states.
in,
In some states.
at
Yeah.
least in California. And then have at it. And then a narrow window during which you can turn in your ballot or mail in your ballot. But those rules for how we vote and when we vote are are of the purview of the state legislators. They're not of the purview of the governor, of the state election officials, of the attorney general, et cetera. And we saw in many of the battleground states where election law was changed independent of the state legislators. And that was the lawsuit, by the way, that Texas filed on behalf of whatever it was, 5 or 6 battleground states to say
A
they
lawsuit that was dismissed out of hand. I think that needs to be added
remember why it was dismissed?
on a technicality, but it was still dismissed. It was dismissed
Right.
because the court
On
said that it
on a,
has no
on a,
standing.
on a technicality, right? It wasn't dismissed based on merit. It was dismissed because Chief Justice Roberts believed that Texas didn't have standing. And of course,
That's right.
there are constitutional scholars that say, well, that's craziness because the only way to adjudicate differences between states is at the Supreme Court. There have been other cases with even lower levels of standing that have made it to the Supreme Court, but I'm not an attorney to argue that. So the point is, though, that in many states, the ways in which they run their elections makes you scratch your head and say, what the heck is going on here? And unfortunately, that had to do with many of the battleground states, that they ran elections in a way that some believe were unconstitutional based on federal law. And that's where That's where the big beef is here. So
So
we
this is where I struggle, Dr. Burke, because you say that there are academics who feel like the majority of academics disagree, right? And that's not to say that there aren't some on the one side, but there are more on the other side who are saying that these were free and fair elections. If you point to Pennsylvania, it's actually the Republican state legislature that put in place the rules that allowed for folks to be able to mail in their ballots because of COVID. So you said that this wasn't the Republican state legislature, but it was in fact the Republicans, and it was the legislature. I agree with you that it's the legislature who controls these things. Now, we can get into a debate about whether that's the right way to handle things. I think if you and I were sitting down and trying to develop a more fair system, that part of what we would change is taking the politics out of it. First thing I would do is make election days a holiday to give more people the ability to get to a polling place. Right? We can sit down and figure out the most fair way to do it, whether or not voter IDs are needed, whether or not we should be mailing them out or people should be requesting them. That's fine. But let's try to make it easier. I think that's the one thing you and I might agree on.
make it easier only if it's legal.
Yeah, only if it's legal. I'm with you.
And by the way, most academics think that this was a free and fair election.
Yes.
Most academics are on the far left. The same academics that have kicked John Eastman out of Chapman University, the same academics that have kicked Alan Dershowitz, one of the few actual liberals left in academia, off Harvard's academic roles. And so academia is infested by those on the left, not the right.
So that's interesting. You bring up a very interesting point. First of all, I would say you shouldn't use words like infested because they have a very strong, should I say, tone to them.
Right? I'm a
doctor. Fair enough. But look, I think it's an interesting point when we talk about academia, because there are two ways to look at that, right? You could say that, okay, academics tend to be more liberal, and then we can get into the whys.
Tend to be?
Tend to look. Again, I'm trying to be objective here. Even if it's 95%, they're not all, and thus I don't know a better word to say. The vast majority of them.
There you go. Yeah.
Right now, there's two ways you can look at that. You could say, well, does that mean that more educated people tend to be more liberal? I would not say that. There are those who do say that. No, exactly. I don't say that because I think that's ridiculous. But what I do think it's important, if you're going to say and if you're going to cite, hey, there's academics who believe, then I think it's also important to remind the listener that, be that as it may, there's probably more academics who disagree. And that's the only reason I was mentioning that. You're absolutely right that academia tends to be more liberal, just like, rural parts of the country tend to be more conservative, just like urban parts of the country tend to be more liberal. I mean, there are certain truths. Now, whether or not that's a good thing, I don't know. Well, we can leave that for another debate. But it is a reality, no doubt about it.
Yeah, I would jump in there, and this is going to show a little bit my bias, but you look at academia and Hollywood being mostly on the left. I don't think they live in the real world. so that's obviously a little my bias coming through, but yeah, I mean, it's, and I want to pull this back a little bit because I know that we kind of got, that was a really good kind of back and forth, but I wanted to bring it back because Dr. Barke, I think what you mentioned about, I'm sorry, Shane, you mentioned the big lie and what it was, they were there based on a quote unquote lie, according to your position. But I think regardless, right, and this is what I always think through, whether you're talking about the Black Lives Matter, like the BLM movement and the protest, and which obviously turned violence, just like the Capitol protest turned to riot, turned violent. The folks that were there in both, right? Because this whole comparison that's come up between what happened at the Capitol and over the summer with the BLM protests. I don't. In some ways, I don't even think it's a fair comparison. But in some ways, I think, in my heart of hearts, they're the beliefs in the core, the core beliefs of the folks that are there to make their point, to protest that they believe. I think that they, in their hearts, believe they're protesting something that's near and dear to their heart. On the BLM side, the way, the system, they truly believe. Now, whether it's true or not is a separate question, right? I think that's where it gets. I think that's kind of this little knob we can turn. But I feel like the beginning of the BLM protests, folks literally felt, oh my gosh, this system is systematically against us Black folks, right?
Yeah.
They I'm sure they truly believe that in their hearts. On the right, on what happened at the Capitol, Shane, we went back and forth about the lie or not, but regardless, I would think, whether it's brainwashing, cult following, whatever, the folks that were there, a lot of them, I believe, probably truly felt like the election was stolen. Their constitutional, liberties are being eroded by this, by this system, and then this left wing guy Biden's going to come in, and the I always like to separate the protagonist of the thing, and then the belief of the folks that are just kind of going along with it and doing the thing that they believe is right. You know what I mean? And that's where I feel like on both sides, if you look at now, you could say they're different because one was sort of instigated or at least not squashed by the leader of our country, where the other one was obviously much different. But I just think there's good folks on both sides, and then you get the madness of crowds type mentality where it just goes over, and then and just people destroying shit, and it just becomes a shit show. I mean, to be honest. But I don't ever want us as a country to stop protesting. I just want to stop right before it goes to riot. You know what I mean? Just protest, yes. Riot, no.
Well, yeah,
It's
no,
just
and I totally agree with you, Vinny. But listen, I wrote an article about Black Lives Matter, and there's really two groups in Black Lives Matter. It's those that believe in the concept that there's a problem with policing and so forth that needs to be changed, and there's a lot of people that resonate with that. And then there's the actual Black Lives Matter formal organization and leadership. And if you and again, don't believe my word, go on the Black Lives Matter website and look at what they stand for. And the leaders of Black Lives Matter acknowledge and admit and say this on video that they are trained Marxists. On the Black Lives Matter website, they talk about ending the nuclear family, although they recently changed that because they got a lot of blowback. So it may not actually still be on their website. But they also talk about, and when you use this kind of language, like Shane said, don't use infested, and fair enough. I should choose my language a bit more carefully. But they use language like that blacks are systematically targeted for demise. Literally, actually, I just pulled up the Black Lives Matter website. We are working for a world where Black lives are no longer systematically targeted for demise. Well, holy cow, if you have a belief that our institutions, specifically law enforcement, and I'm involved in law enforcement, I'm a reserve deputy for a local law enforcement agency, and I work for the SWAT team. So, as a matter of fact, we'll be on alert this coming Wednesday for worries about protests and so forth in Southern California. And I work with a lot of these folks of all different colors, black, white, red, green, you name it. And I haven't met a racist cop in the years that I've worked for law enforcement. As a matter of fact, when you talk about law enforcement interacting with the African American community, there is such great caution and almost to the point where it could be, from a law enforcement standpoint, dangerous because they are scared to engage for fear that somebody has a camera on, or that they would be labeled racist, or that they would do something that could even be slightly perceived as being too aggressive or too in your face. So I think, as a matter of fact, the result of it, the so-called Ferguson effect, is actually real. So when you look at Black Lives Matter website and they use such inflammatory language, and they have a belief system that I don't agree with, about the nuclear family, and that blacks are targeted for systemic demise, it's no wonder that some people, if you truly believe that, then you can sort of understand through the lens of people that are protesting and throwing bricks and demanding for the defunding of law enforcement, where that comes from. So our words and our rhetoric have consequences. And as it relates to Black Lives Matter, I'm worried about the hyperbolic rhetoric that the leaders of this organization, that get tremendous amounts of money donated to them and then distributed to democratic causes, what they are actually causing as a result of their rhetoric on written language and how they speak. So it's hard for me to imagine that somebody would want to be involved in an organization whose leaders are acknowledged to be Marxists, who fight for the demise of the nuclear family, whose belief system is that African Americans and other minorities are literally systematically targeted to be killed. Holy cow! Why would anybody want to be involved in an organization like
I
that.
just think I don't think anyone, and Shane, I'll give you a response in a second. I don't think anyone could would say, "Oh no, I want to be part." I mean, there's probably the fringe in those organizations that truly believe those statements that are on their website. But I think I would maybe this is wishful thinking. I would honestly hope the majority of them are just looking for justice as they see it, and not and they I went on a run the other day, and I was like, if an alien came to this earth and just saw like Black Lives Matter on a bumper sticker, they would say, well, of course. Why don't they? What do you mean? But
But
if someone says, do you support Black Lives Matter? I can actually feel my blood pressure going up, because I'm like, I've had these conversations with people, and it's like, well, of course Black Lives Matter. I could not care what you are. You're a human life. But just saying if you have a Black Lives Matter like shirt on, you are already put in this category of political, like what you just articulated, Dr. Barke. Like, is that how we would view that person? Now, I would tend to think no, they were just someone that believes that they're trying to help that cause, but not in that extreme, with that extreme mission statement that you just articulated, I would hope.
Well, I would certainly hope, Shane, that the majority of people that would choose to wear a Black Lives Matter shirt or a flag or a pin or what have you actually have never been on the Black Lives Matter website and actually don't know what their mission statement is or what their leader's background is. That's what I hope and pray is actually the case. And I don't know if that's true or not, but I certainly hope so. Because if there are folks that are wearing Black Lives Matter, the majority of them t-shirts, and support the cause, that understand the leaders are Marxists, that understand the mission statement is to dissolve the nuclear family, and that their belief system is that there's a systematic attempt to kill people of color, boy, that's a really, really scary thing. I don't believe that. I don't know anybody that does believe that in my life, as I'm sure is the case with you, Shane. I don't give a rat's you know what about the color of anybody's skin, their nationality, their religion, their sexual orientation is meaningless to me. All I care about is if I'm hiring them, their ability to do the job, the merits of their skill set, and irrespective of any of those other characteristics. But it is my understanding and what I see and hear from our leaders in Washington that they divide people based on characteristics that have nothing to do with what Martin Luther King asked us to do, and that is judge people by the content of their character and ignore their skin color, ignore their race, ignore their religion, ignore their sexual orientation. That's what I try to do in my personal life and my daily life. But it seems too often people on the left try to actually divide us by characteristics that are meaningless. And isn't that, I mean, I'm not a historian, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not a politician, but my understanding is that's what Marxism is really all about, this division by materialistic, non-character based attributes. And if that's what Black Lives Matter is all about and the followers, it's very, very sad to me.
So I'll jump in here. This is a lot to chew on and a lot to debate there. The first thing I'm going to say is I grew up on Long Island. I have a ton of friends in New York City, the vast majority of which are liberal. I'm also, spent the last 10 years serving our country abroad, and I've met folks from all over on both sides. The vast majority of the ones that I've met, not to be overly anecdotal, but in no way support Marxism, in no way support the dissolution of the nuclear family, in no way support the concept that America is trying to kill Black people. But what they all, to a person, those who support Black Lives Matter, believe is that America, to this day, because of historical reasons that are really difficult to argue with, is still skewed against Black people, all other things being equal. Now, you said a lot in there about Marxism, and I agree with you, right? So the concept of Marxism was that the proletariat had to rise up against the bourgeoisie. And if you read the Communist Manifesto, or if you read Das Kapital, which I've done in German, what it will tell you is that that division, as you pointed out, was the problem. And you're absolutely right. However, to gloss over the fact that there are very real divisions still in our country, many of them based on skin color, whether or not you aren't a racist, and I completely believe that you aren't, nor the people that you're around. But to say that systemic racism isn't still a problem in the United States is I'm sorry to use this word, laughable, because it is. whether you want to look at the percentage of the population that's in prison versus the percentage of the African American population to the overall population, whether you want to look at the number of CEOs that are African American, the number of folks in schools that make it to Ivy League schools that are African Americans, or any, that's even with affirmative action. On almost any metric that you look at, African Americans are underrepresented. To me, if that's not proof of systemic racism in our country, then I don't know what is. But going back to the broader point, this concept of tying all the folks who were at these protests, 99% of whom were nonviolent, and I can pull up the actual stats of that, and then trying to say, no, they're actually tied in with those 1% who were looting and rioting, while also 20 minutes earlier saying, hey, thousands of people were at the Capitol, but they weren't the ones who were inside the building. They were just there non-peacefully. That's hypocritical, right? And at the end of the day, if you look around and you look to your left, and there's a guy with a Camp Auschwitz sweatshirt, and you look to your right, and there's a guy with a 6MWE, which means 6 million weren't enough on your right, those are Nazis. And if those are the type of people that you're around, you might want to question whether or not you're on the right side of history. And again, I'm not saying that everyone at these protests was that. They're not. But I think we need to be very careful if we're on the one hand pointing to the minority and trying to paint the majority with that same brush, while glossing over the fact that the same thing's happening on the other side.
Yeah, no, Shane, and I agree with you. I'm not glossing over. I'm not suggesting that people that were protesting over the summer, that most of them weren't peaceful. They may very well have been, and they are, just like people on the mall that were there to support Trump and rallying. Almost all of them were peaceful, except for the knuckleheads that went into the Capitol. I disagree with your premise that there is systemic racism. If there is institutional racism, if there is, and I don't think there is, we need to look at who controls the institutions: academia, Hollywood, the media, education.
Wait, hold on. Let's go back. Academia does not control the criminal justice system. Hollywood does not control the criminal justice system. I'm sorry, that's just not true. And that's the biggest, and then the root cause of Black Lives Matter, the root cause of why most of the folks were on the street was because of our criminal justice system. You're right that academia is skewed left. So sure, maybe that'll explain part of why schools are biased towards a certain group or another. But I'm sorry, the concept that the criminal justice system is in any way run by either the media or academia or Hollywood, it's just not right.
I didn't say it was, but you said blacks are disproportionately underrepresented in academia. Who controls academia?
But hold on a second. The question isn't whether or not the liberals who are the professors are the problem, or if it's because the socioeconomic status and thus the education system that is skewed against them. In other words, they're starting off from birth X steps behind. You earlier mentioned a really interesting point, and that's believing in equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome. I actually agree with you. I agree with you.
A lot of people on the left don't agree with that.
Well, so this is good because I'm not like a lot on the left, right? I'm actually relatively centrist. And this is actually an interesting debate I had the other day because the government in the Netherlands just fell, and our ambassador looked at me and said, well, can you tell me a little bit about what was going on? And I gave him a briefing. And at one point, I actually mentioned that a center-right coalition was going to form. And he goes, center-right? That's a left-wing party. And I said, well, sir, the center in Europe and the center in America are two different things. Right. And the only reason I mentioned that is to say the political spectrum in America has shifted quite significantly. That all being said, I think we need to take a step back and ask ourselves, what is the fundamental issue that those folks are out there for? On the one hand, you had folks who were out there arguing that the criminal justice system is biased. On the other side, you had folks out there believing, and this is where you and I disagree, but I don't know how we get past this, but believing that an election was stolen from them, that thus far, no court has been willing to agree with, that thus far, no state has been willing to agree with. So to me, they are fundamentally different things and need to be viewed as such.
Yeah,
but
no, I can see where you could think that.
But if I just could jump in 1 second, aren't they the same in the sense, Shane, that the people, like I was kind of trying to articulate before, the people that are doing the protesting in their hearts, potentially in their hearts, believed what they're protesting. Whether because I just heard Dr. Barke say he does not believe that institutional racism is a thing. However, the folks protesting over the summer, the BLM protests, believe that in their hearts. At least some or most of them, I would imagine. It's just as you, and on the flip side, right? The whole, whether or not there was massive amounts of, systemic fraud during the election, whether that's true or not, the folks there believed it in their hearts. So in that way, I would say they that is what similarity in the two
No,
of
but
them.
here's what Shane is saying. Shane, let me see if I can correctly articulate what I think you're saying.
Please.
BLM people that were protesting over the summer, in your perspective, were accurately perceiving that there's a problem, and they were protesting, for lack of a better word, for a righteous cause. People that were on the mall last week perceived something that wasn't actually true, so their cause wasn't righteous, but yet there they were protesting. In your words, they were actually protesting a lie, whereas the BLM people were protesting a truth.
You said it perfectly. To
Yeah.
me, the fact that they both believe something isn't what's important. It's what are they believing. Look, and this is actually what I was talking about before. We have to get back to a point of actually having shared facts. So it's interesting. We talk about the unique nature of what's happening today. It's actually not unique. So in the 1850s, right? So before the Civil War, before there were national newspapers, you had the same level of tribalization and polarization because you'd have completely different, literally the different news coming out of the same event. You'd have a Lincoln debate, and on the one side, you'd have the Republicans, who back then were today's Democrats and vice versa, right? They were the more liberals back then, and they would have said Lincoln was the most amazing thing. His speech caused the crowd to jump up and cheer. And then you'd have the other side put out a newspaper and say Lincoln was so awful in his debate that he actually fainted or whatever. And we've somehow come full circle, and we're back to that point again today. Now, the difference is that back then there was just local newspapers. Today it's because of social media and cable news. But regardless, the principle of having shared facts has gone away, and I don't know how to bridge that. That's the divide we need to bridge.
Well, there we have clarity. My articulation of what you believe, BLM versus Trump, clarity over agreement. We're clear about what you believe. I don't agree with you, but at least we're clear about where we disagree. And part of the problem is that there's people that don't believe your facts, and there's people that don't believe the facts that I believe, and we're stuck. We're really stuck. And some of these things aren't perfectly objective; they are subjective, and that's why I worry when you hear President-elect Biden say things about the other side. I mean, traditionally, when there's a power change, I remember Ronald Reagan made some comments to his transition team. He took over from Jimmy Carter to say, I don't care what you say, but I don't want you to say one disrespectful word to the side that voted for Jimmy Carter, because they're part of America and we need to all come together. That's not happening right now on the left with the Biden administration. They continue to beat up the right over you name it, and they continue to criticize. They liken the right to Nazis. They blame Trump for everything that's wrong in the United States, and and I don't think that's helpful.
It's interesting. I'm glad you raised that, because again, this gets back to the shared facts concept. So the first thing I'll say is there aren't actually different facts, right? Facts are not subjective. Facts are facts. That there's an objectiveness to them. There is either fraud happened or fraud didn't happen. There is either this is right or this is not correct, right? So I don't know how we get beyond a point if we can't necessarily agree that after something is analyzed and looked at, it is what it is, whatever it is.
Analyzed and looked at by who?
So if we're taking the case, let's use the example of science, right? So if science has a theory that's posited, gravity is real, and 1,000 researchers do 1,000 different tests, and 1,000 of them come back, and they're all saying, "Hey, gravity's real." Then at some point we need to all look around and say, "Okay, gravity's real." So in the case of voter fraud, if there's all these cases, and at no point do you have anything other than like Johnny over here signed his mother's name and sent in the ballot, and Mikey over here did the same thing, then at some point we have to all agree and say, hey, look, they weren't lying to us. All the
Yeah.
states agreed there's
Yeah.
no fraud,
Yeah.
right? At some point, we need to get to that point. Now, I recognize that this all happened quickly, and I understand that there's a lot of people who are pissed off on the other side. I totally get that. But, and this is really important, you said the President-elect Biden hasn't been as unifying as you might have liked, or that the left has been
Conciliatory.
or conciliatory. I don't know that I'd necessarily agree, but I also don't know that I would necessarily disagree. So I don't want to like argue that point. But what I will say is looking at the other side, you also have a president who's the first in literally 100+ years who won't even go to the inauguration of his successor, who won't even at this point admit that he lost the election. He is at least thus far has said he is going to peacefully leave, and that's a step. But it took months. So, it's interesting because the right, and this is the sort of the fascinating perspective, the right looks at the president-elect and says, well, he's not being as conciliatory as we need him to be, when for the last 4 years, the current president has been nothing but divisive. I literally can't think of one time where Donald Trump has tried to unify or be conciliatory to the left.
So Shane, you do know, and you're familiar with former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's rhetoric over the last 4 years, where she has repeatedly said Trump stole the election, he's an illegitimate president, and then we must fight. You're familiar with that, right?
So I will say this: I don't actually know what like document or statements you're talking about, but sure.
Yeah. So it's not just the right that doesn't like to concede. Hillary Clinton to this day continues to say that Trump is illegitimate and he stole the election.
But Dr. Barke, she did concede the night of the election. She didn't say, that this wasn't a fair election. She immediately conceded. At no point did Donald Trump do that, or rather, he hasn't done that up until now. And all he's done is conceding that he's going to leave. He hasn't actually conceded that he lost.
Yeah, well, there are many people on the right that believe that although he lost from the standpoint of President-elect Biden will be inaugurated, that there was enough fraud and shenanigans that had they been adjudicated and looked at, could have had a different outcome. I think that is a belief system on the right, and I understand that you think that. No, it's not flat earthism.
It is. There's 6. Come on, it would have had to happen in 6 states. Thousands and thousands of votes across all these states when they can't even bring up enough evidence to switch a couple of hundred votes. To me, that is flat eartherism. If you have a group of people who say, well, I don't believe it, regardless of the evidence that I keep being shown. So I guess my question is, what evidence would they need to be shown in order for them to finally come around? And I fear that the answer is there is none. And that's what I'm scared of.
I think they feel like it wasn't adjudicated. That the evidence wasn't fully presented to the American people or to a court to look at, and I think that's where they are. That's where they have their beef, if you will. That they believe that if a court had looked at this, that they would have seen enough irregularities and constitutional problems in the way the election was held in many of the battleground states, that the outcome could have been different. I'm not an expert on all the details of the election, and quite frankly, I don't agree with many of the people that are continuing to protest the results. I think it's time to move on, and it's time to fight our battle as a opposition party. And like the left always does, I think they're going to overplay their hand. And ultimately, in the midterm elections, we'll take back the House and maybe the Senate and have an opportunity for our leadership to take back the White House in 4 years. So, I mean, this ebbs and flows. This is the way it goes. But, the past Republican wins in the White House, every single White House win over the past decade has been protested by the left in Congress, from Barbara Boxer to Hillary Clinton to other congressmen and senators that have also challenged the electors. But when they do it, it's righteous. It's part of the constitutional right for them to do so. When we do it, it's because we're racist and we believe in conspiracy theories. So there's a lot of hypocrisy on the left when hundreds of Republican Congress people protest the outcome, and when our senators do, they're trying to be railed out of town and doxxed from their job. And I just don't think that's right.
So again, I think this is the alternate facts portion, and I'm actually really glad we had this conversation. I hope it continues because I'm I'm not going anywhere right now, but I don't know how we get past the fundamental disagreement of where facts lie. If we can't agree on what the truth is, then I don't know. Then we're never going to get to a point where we can even begin to agree on something.
Well, I think Congress should put together a bipartisan committee to study what happened and to make recommendations for a path forward to be sure the next election cycle is better than it was this cycle.
I am with you that there should always be, not just now, but there should always be attempts to improve things. But I won't legitimize the notion that this was anything other than a free and fair election, because there is not a shred of evidence to indicate that it wasn't anything other than that.
I appreciate your enthusiastic opinion to that, and I just and better than agreement, we have clarity, because I disagree with you.
I mean, I'll summarize this by saying, I think, Shane, you mentioned facts are facts, and of course we'd all agree with that. No matter what, this problem is never going to go away. I think we need to do what we're doing now and have these type of discussions, and hope, want to have a lot more of these. But I think the reality is there's so much data to look at, to evaluate, no matter what issue you're looking at. You can turn knobs, whether it's confirmation bias, whether it's, whatever it might be, you could find enough data to build a case against your point, to your point. And that's all I'm hearing, right? I don't think I got two very intelligent people talking right now, and you could put, each one of you can probably convince a nation of what you just said. I know that for a fact. So, and I mean that as a complimentary way, but it's also a problem with just the fact that there's so much data out there. No matter what tax plan gets released, if the left put it out, it's the worst thing. It's going to bankrupt middle America, by the Republicans. And if you flip the other way, it's like the best thing ever. Here's all the data to show how this is going to prop the middle class up. I mean, there's too much data. You can turn the knobs any way you want. I think the key is intellectual honesty and just exploration. And I think that's what we're doing. So awesome. I do want to close with COVID. Obviously, Dr. Barke, this is near and dear to you. You're really close to it. I'm sure, Shane, you'll have some opinions on it. I'm going to venture to say, Shane, you think I think, based on our earlier conversation, you think the administration could have handled COVID a lot better. And Dr. Barke, you probably think President Trump and his administration did a much better job than what maybe Shane would think. That's an assumption.
Yeah, I mean, listen. Looking back, you can always look at ways that things could have been done better. That's just the nature of emergencies and the nature of critical things that come up. You can always look back at how you handled something and say, I could have done this, that, or the other better. Because of our federalism system, though, there's been a tremendous difference between how states have handled the rollout of the vaccination and the lockdowns with the economy and so forth. And I think in general, there are exceptions. States that are run by the right did a better job. States that are run by the left, like my state in California, that have had draconian lockdowns that have served no purpose but to hurt the economy, to hurt business people, and to not save a single life, I think have done a much poorer job. I know personally, just from a healthcare provider that has been treating literally hundreds of COVID patients, that the politics literally has infected healthcare. So the day that Donald Trump, during one of his COVID briefings, made mention of a drug called hydroxychloroquine, that drug immediately became political to the point where pharmacies were refusing to dispense my prescription to my patient based on my judgment, based on my knowledge of the science. They literally refused to dispense a medication that has been safe and well proven, has been around for 65 years, used for a variety of conditions, including rheumatoid arthritis and systemic lupus, has shown efficacy against COVID. They were refusing because politics has infected healthcare. And that continues today, where there's this push for the vaccination. I'm not anti-vax, but a lack of information about early treatment for mild disease that I think has caused unnecessary harm to the public. Even with the rollout of the vaccination, we see differences in how that's rolled out state to state. In California, unfortunately, we have not targeted the most vulnerable. We know who the most vulnerable are by looking at the CDC's own statistics. 80% of the deaths have occurred in people older than 65 years old. Yet we're giving out vaccinations to politicians, to healthcare workers that are not even on the front line, and to others that aren't in a high risk group, as opposed to singularly focusing on those that are most at risk. And it's very unfortunate that those of us in the healthcare industry that speak out, we are criticized. We're called quacks. We're tempted to be doxxed. I have friends that have lost their jobs because they spoke out on behalf of hydroxychloroquine, and healthcare has become quite political in this COVID environment.
Yeah, so I'll just say this. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a scientist. I know better than to try and comment on things that I'm not an expert on. So in terms of hydroxychloroquine's efficacy or not, I'm just going to trust the CDC and people like Dr. Fauci and people like you, Dr. Barke. I have no idea. If you think it's the right thing to give your patient, sure, great. I don't know. So I'm not even going to pretend to debate you on that front. The only thing I will argue is the concept from a public policy management standpoint of lockdowns. I think that's an actually fascinating thing because I spent the first 6 months of the pandemic in the United States, and I've spent the last 6 months here in Europe, where they take a drastically different perspective on how to deal with the outbreak. Here, they go into full lockdown. They shut the economy down completely, and they have saved a lot of lives. Right. So you said it doesn't save any lives. I got to disagree with you on that front. It has saved lives here. Right now, the U.S. the federalized system. You're absolutely right. So
what are the consequences of a lockdown, though?
They're significant, and I don't want to downplay them. And this is why, again, I'm not advocating for one over the other. I'm just trying to point out that there are other data points when it comes to how to manage a public health crisis, and that one isn't necessarily completely right or completely wrong. I'm just saying the Europeans have decided to take a different tack. And while they've had less death on the COVID front, it's true. They're going to have more psychological issues. They're going to have certainly folks who are economically hit. But keep in mind, because they have a strong welfare state, they're subsidizing those people who aren't making their money. So if you're a shop owner and you haven't been able to make your money selling, X widget, then the government's paying you. That's how they operate here. It's different. It's different. I'm not advocating for it. I'm not careful. This has got to be really careful here. I'm not advocating for their system. I'm just trying to point out that they have another way of doing things. Now, in the U.S., you said that left-leaning states did bad, right-leaning states are good. I don't know that that's right.
It's a generalization.
It's a generalization. I think California bungled it for sure. I think New York struggled at first, but they were also the first state to really get smashed with it. I think since then, and it's my home state, so I'll call it out, they've done actually a pretty good job considering the population density. And again, you're the doctor, but I'm pretty sure any place that has a higher population density is going to be more drastically affected by a virus, just because it's easier to jump from one person that's closer to you than if you live somewhere where density isn't as high.
Sure.
That all being said, the more interesting debate that I'm going to get in, rather than the healthcare side, because that's not me, is the public policy side. And I won't advocate for one or the other, but I will say that is a very legitimate debate that's being had, and I think we are seeing it play out in real time.
Yeah, we are. We've got Governor Cuomo from New York, who just recently came out and said, you know what, lockdowns don't work. We need to find a path to open up the economy. We got Governor Lightfoot in Illinois that just came out and said, just kidding, the lockdowns aren't working. We need to open up the economy. Interesting that this was done after the election, not before the election. Political motives in lockdown? Maybe. I'm not going to ascribe motives to people that made these kind of decisions, but I think it was wrong to lock down the economy. We're seeing the highest suicide rate we've ever seen in the United States, short of the Great Depression. We're seeing the devastation of small businesses that is disproportionately hurting the minority and particularly the African American community. We're seeing missed opportunities for intervention in healthcare. We see cancer screenings that have been missed. I read about a patient who missed their annual mammogram and ultimately developed stage 4 breast cancer because the early stages were missed. I've seen colonoscopies that have been missed, and the result is colon cancer. So unfortunately, too many people aren't asking, what is the consequences of the lockdown? What is the risk-benefit ratio? From a pure COVID standpoint, that's one thing. But from a broader healthcare standpoint, that's a whole nother thing. I believe the lockdowns cause far more harm than good. I think there's a much better path, as articulated by Jay Bhattacharya out of Stanford, who penned and authored the Great Barrington Declaration of a focused protection strategy. Protect those that are most vulnerable, and we know clearly who those are, and allow the rest of us, especially the younger people, to go about our business. And I think that's
So let me ask that,
that's an
Barke. What would you
effective
say? What
strategy.
would you say to the Europeans who would say, "Well, you made all these arguments, yet we've gone a completely different way. We don't have the level of suicide that the United States has had. We don't have the level of economic devastation because the government has stepped in and subsidized and paid for and backed and funded all those folks who would have lost their jobs. And we don't have as many people dying of COVID. So we would argue we're doing better."
Well, I don't agree with those. I don't agree with that. Your statistics aren't accurate. You could look at the Swedish model that did quite well until recently, when they decided now to lock down. They pretty much did not lock down their society. They did not ruin their economy. Their COVID deaths per capita are on par with everybody else. And then there are societies that did lock down, and despite the lockdowns, like in California, despite the lockdowns, despite the mask mandates, California is number one in new cases. And yet here we are, but we're number 40 in deaths per capita. So lockdowns simply don't work except on a very temporary measure if healthcare systems are being overwhelmed, which was the case that we were worried about early on when the so-called "we need to flatten the curve for 2 weeks" that turned into 6 months was implemented.
Well, let's wrap this up. So Shane, Dr. Barke, I think this was awesome. We got to do a part 2 of this because I got too many notes here to just leave outstanding. And plus, this is the easiest podcast I've ever done. I just kind of hung out and listened to you guys talk. So I zero work on my part. So very cool. Loved it, guys. And Dr. Barke, enjoy the 70s degree weather. And Shane, what are you at? 25?
Yeah,
21?
25 and dreary.
Shane, first let me say thank you for your time and your civil discussion. I appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely.
Vinny, thanks for giving us the forum. Yes, I'd love to do this again, and we can go off on other topics as well. And hopefully we'll have a peaceful transition of power coming up next week, and we'll put the Trump administration behind us, and now we'll focus the spotlight on what President-elect Biden has in mind for us for the next 4 years.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Thank you for taking the time to chat. I think this was great. And I really do believe that it's civil conversation that's going to move us forward. Right. And I think if you're up for it, I'd love to do this again.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, very cool. Thanks, Vinny. Have a great day and rest of your weekend
as well.
All right, you guys take care.
All the best.
Bye-bye.